I was always the type of guy who focused on my work. My name's Alex Grayson, and for years, I've been running a successful business. Long hours, endless meetings, and frequent business trips kept me away from home more than I'd like to admit. I thought I was doing the right thing, providing for my wife, Tess, making sure we lived comfortably, and giving her everything I thought she needed. I was wrong. Tess never complained, but over time, it became clear that something was wrong. At first, I thought it was just the routine of marriage settling in. She was a stay-at-home wife, and I was always out of the house. It seemed normal, right? But as the months turned into years, I began to notice subtle changes in her. Little things, like the way she'd look at me when I came home late, or the distant tone in her voice when we talked. She was there physically, but emotionally, she was slipping away from me. I didn't understand it at the time. I had always believed that as long as I was working hard, providing, and being a decent husband, everything would be fine. But Tess felt differently. She didn't say much at first. She never really did. But I could see the growing loneliness in her eyes. I could see how much she craved more than just the routine of our days. She didn't want the empty, hollow conversations that we had about the business or the occasional acknowledgement of the things she'd done around the house. She wanted me. She wanted my attention, my affection, my time. But I was too absorbed in my own world to see it. Then came Garrett. We had just moved into a new neighborhood, and Garrett was one of the first people to introduce himself. A young guy, maybe in his late 20s, who had just moved into a house down the street. He had that charm about him, the kind of guy who could walk into any room and immediately make friends. It wasn't long before he started hanging around our place. At first, it was just casual, the kind of neighborly help you offer when someone's moving in. He'd come over to help with the heavy lifting, assist with things I didn't have the time for. He was always so eager to help, and I, in my usual obliviousness, thought little of it. But Tess seemed to enjoy his company. At first, I thought it was just because he was being friendly. She would laugh at his jokes, and I could see the spark in her eyes that had been missing for so long. It didn't sit well with me, but I brushed it off. Tess was just being polite, I told myself. After all, she hadn't said anything, and she never seemed to mind when I came home late from work. But deep down, something felt off. Garrett wasn't like me. He didn't spend his time talking about business or work. Instead, he listened. He actually listened to Tess when she spoke about things that mattered to her. About the books she was reading, the music she loved, her dreams that had long been forgotten in the chaos of daily life. He didn't try to fix things, didn't try to make everything better with a solution. He just listened and validated her feelings. That was something I hadn't done in years. Tess had stopped asking me for my thoughts or my input because I was always too busy or too tired to care. I noticed it slowly at first, Tess spending more and more time with Garrett. They would go on long walks around the neighborhood, talking about whatever came to mind. They'd sit outside in the evenings, chatting about everything and nothing at all. I tried to tell myself it was harmless, that it was just a friendship, but it wasn't. I could see it in the way she looked at him, in the way her eyes lit up when he came around. Something had changed. Tess was no longer looking at me the same way. She was looking at him. I could feel the gap between us widening. I was busy with work, pouring myself into the business to avoid confronting what was happening. But I knew, deep down, something was wrong. Tess wasn't the same. And I wasn't the same either. One night, Garrett came over again. I'd been out of town for a few days, and Tess had been texting me about how much she missed me, but when I walked into the house that evening, it didn't feel the way it used to. Garrett was there, helping her prepare dinner. The sound of their laughter echoed through the house, and for a moment, I stood there in the doorway, just watching. I didn't say anything at first, but the tension in the room was palpable. I don't know why I didn't speak up, why I didn't feel the need to intervene. Maybe it was because I already knew what was happening, but I didn't want to admit it. Tess turned to me and gave me a half-hearted smile. "Hey, Alex," she said, as if nothing was wrong. But it wasn't normal. I could feel the walls closing in on me. The distance between us was growing, and I wasn't sure how to bridge it. Garrett, on the other hand, seemed to have no such problem. He just smiled at me, that charming smile of his, and offered me a drink. "Everything okay, man?" he asked casually. I didn't answer right away. Part of me wanted to confront him, but I held back. Instead, I said, "Yeah, everything's fine." But everything wasn't fine. I didn't know it at the time, but that moment was the beginning of everything unraveling. That night, as I sat there, listening to their laughter and watching the way Garrett and Tess interacted, I felt something inside me snap. I wasn't angry yet, but I was frustrated, confused, and more than a little afraid. Tess and I didn't talk much that night. I could tell she felt the same unease I did, but neither of us knew how to address it. As I lay in bed later, staring at the ceiling, I couldn't stop thinking about Garrett. I tried to tell myself it was nothing, that Tess was just being friendly. But deep down, I knew the truth. She was slipping away from me, and I had no one but myself to blame. The next morning, things felt off. Tess was distant, and Garrett wasn't around much. I didn't know where he'd gone, but I found myself resenting him. Resenting the way he could make Tess smile in a way I hadn't in years. Resenting the way he could talk to her in a way that felt so effortless, while I was still fumbling through the motions of being a husband. Things weren't going to stay the same. I could feel it in my gut. Something was about to change, and I wasn't ready for it. The days following that night in the kitchen, when I first realized how distant Alex had become, felt like I was living in a dream. Everything seemed to be in a constant state of flux. Alex continued to focus on his business, on his long hours and endless meetings. Every time I tried to talk to him, to express how I was feeling, it was like I was talking to a wall. He was too tired, too preoccupied with whatever new problem had cropped up at work. His detachment was suffocating, and the silence between us became louder and more painful. I felt like I was living with a stranger. There were no longer the quiet moments we used to share after dinner, no more late-night talks or soft laughter. I couldn't even complain about the loneliness anymore. Alex didn't care enough to notice it, and I stopped trying to get his attention. The emotional distance between us was impossible to ignore, and I started to think that maybe this was how things were going to be from now on. Maybe this was just what marriage had become: cold, routine, and empty. And then there was Garrett. At first, I had told myself that it was just a friendship. I kept convincing myself that nothing was happening, that it was harmless. But every time I saw him, every time we spent time together, something shifted inside me. Garrett had a way of making me feel alive again. He listened to me in a way Alex never did. When I talked about my hopes and dreams, he didn't brush me off or make me feel stupid for even having them. He didn't look at me with the same tired eyes that Alex often did. Garrett was different. And God, it was like a breath of fresh air after being suffocated for so long. It didn't take long before I found myself spending more and more time with him. We'd meet for coffee, go on long walks, talk about books, music, anything that made me feel like I mattered. With Garrett, I wasn't just the woman I had become in my marriage to Alex. I was me again. The woman who had dreams, who had passions, who had a life to live outside of being someone's wife. He made me feel seen, and it was a feeling I hadn't had in years. In a way, I had stopped expecting Alex to see me. I had stopped hoping that things would go back to how they were before. I had settled into this new reality of being alone in a relationship. But Garrett made me question everything. Every time he was near, I felt a spark inside me that had been dormant for so long. I was no longer just talking to someone. I was connecting with him in a way I hadn't connected with anyone in years. And then came that night in the kitchen. Garrett and I had spent the evening together, cooking dinner and laughing over the smallest things. I was so comfortable with him, like I could just be myself. There were no pretenses, no expectations. It was so easy. And as we stood there, my back to the counter, he brushed against me as he reached for something in the cabinet. The touch was innocent at first, just the slightest graze of his hand on my shoulder, but it sent a shock through me, like electricity. My heart raced, and for the first time in a long time, I felt something inside me stir. I turned to him, and our eyes locked. I knew then that everything had changed. In that moment, it wasn't about sex or anything physical. It was about something deeper, something that had been missing in my life for so long. It was a connection. I couldn't deny it anymore. I couldn't pretend that this was just a friendship. Garrett had become more than that. He had become someone I could trust, someone who made me feel special, someone who filled the gaps in my heart that had been hollowed out by years of neglect from Alex. Without a word, Garrett moved closer. His eyes softened, and he said, "You deserve more, Tess. So much more than what you've been given." I didn't know how to respond. It was like a dam had broken inside me, and all the emotions I'd been holding back for so long came flooding to the surface. I had felt ignored, forgotten, and unimportant for years. But Garrett made me feel like I mattered again. And in that moment, I didn't care about the consequences. We kissed. It wasn't just a kiss. It was a release. It was the culmination of everything I had been longing for, everything I had been missing. His lips were soft, and as he kissed me, I felt the years of loneliness fall away. In his arms, I was no longer invisible. I was someone worthy of love and attention. I pulled away, my heart racing, my breath shallow. I didn't know what to say, what to do. It felt so right, but at the same time, it terrified me. I couldn't stop thinking about Alex, about what this would mean for my marriage. But in that moment, all those doubts and fears seemed so distant. Garrett's gaze was intense as he whispered, "Tess, it's okay. You don't have to hide how you feel." And I didn't. I didn't have to pretend anymore. I didn't have to keep pretending that everything was fine when it wasn't. In that moment, Garrett became more than just a friend. He became my support, my partner, and the one person who made me feel like I was truly alive. But as the days passed, I couldn't shake the guilt. I knew what I was doing was wrong, but I didn't know how to stop. Garrett had become a part of my life in ways I hadn't expected, and I didn't know how to undo what had already been set in motion. The more time I spent with Garrett, the more I realized how emotionally distant Alex had become. He didn't notice the changes in me, didn't see how much I had shifted. Every day, I became more and more aware of how far apart we were, how disconnected we had become. Garrett was the person who saw me, who valued me, and I couldn't ignore that anymore. I had fallen into something I couldn't easily escape from, and I didn't know how to make things right. All I knew was that every moment with Garrett felt like a glimpse into the life I had always wanted. And with each passing day, I felt myself slipping further away from the life I had built with Alex. But Alex had no idea. He was still lost in his own world, too consumed with his work to even notice the cracks in our marriage. The weight of the secret I had been carrying for so long was starting to crush me. I could feel the tension building in the air every time Garrett and I were together. Every time I saw Alex's tired eyes that were so focused on his work. The more I tried to pretend that everything was normal, the more the truth gnawed at me. I had spent years feeling invisible to Alex. The emotional distance between us had become so vast that, in many ways, I no longer felt like his wife. I was more like a roommate, just someone who happened to share a house with him. But with Garrett, I felt seen. I felt important. He gave me the one thing I had craved for so long: attention, understanding, and emotional connection. It was intoxicating. But as time went on, I started to feel like I was living a lie. This wasn't just a friendship anymore. This was something far more dangerous. The guilt crept in, but every time I saw Garrett, every time he smiled at me, I pushed it aside. I told myself it was okay, that I deserved to feel alive again, that Alex had long since stopped caring enough to make me feel this way. But I could feel the walls closing in. Alex started asking more questions. I could see it in the way he looked at me, like he was trying to figure out what had changed. He noticed how often I was out, how my mood had shifted. I couldn't lie to him anymore, but I didn't know how to tell him the truth. Every time I tried to say something, I felt my words get stuck in my throat. I wanted to explain everything, how I felt so alone, how I had fallen into Garrett's arms because of how abandoned I felt, but I couldn't find the courage. And then, one evening, Alex decided to do something that surprised me. He stayed home. He planned a special dinner, hoping to surprise me, to bring some normalcy back into our lives. But of course, I had already made plans. I had told Garrett I'd go for a walk with him, to talk about some things, to just get away from the house. I didn't know how to explain that to Alex, though. I couldn't tell him I was going to see Garrett. I couldn't tell him that I was already slipping further away from him. When I came back home that night, expecting to find Alex working late or out with friends, I walked into the house to find him sitting at the kitchen table. The light was dim, and there was an eerie quiet in the air. I didn't say anything at first, but I could see the way he was staring at me, his eyes hard and unreadable. And then I saw it. My phone was lying on the table, face up. I froze. Alex didn't say a word. He just looked at me, his gaze piercing through me. I felt the blood drain from my face as I walked closer to the table. The phone was unlocked. I hadn't locked it because I hadn't felt the need to. After all, who would be snooping through my messages? But Alex was different. He had noticed something. And now, he had found the evidence. The text messages from Garrett were there, in plain view. The words on the screen burned into my brain as if they were searing my soul. Messages filled with longing, with feelings I had never shared with Alex. And at the very bottom of the screen, the message that shattered everything: I want you, Tess. I could feel my heart stop. I stood there, unable to move, unable to speak. The world around me seemed to blur as everything I had worked so hard to hide came crashing down. Alex's eyes never left me, and the silence between us was deafening. I could feel the lump in my throat, the weight of the guilt settling over me like a suffocating blanket. I had no excuses, no way to explain away what I had done. This wasn't just an emotional betrayal. It was a full-on betrayal of everything Alex and I had built. And there was no turning back now. Alex, I whispered, my voice barely audible. But he didn't respond. He just stared at me, his face a mixture of anger and disbelief. I could feel the panic rising inside me. I couldn't lose him. I couldn't. But as I looked into his eyes, I knew that I already had. Finally, Alex spoke. Is this what you've been doing behind my back? His voice was cold, like a blade slicing through the tension. I couldn't speak. I didn't know what to say. How could I explain the way I felt, the emptiness that had consumed me for so long? How could I explain that Garrett had become a lifeline, someone who had made me feel like I mattered again, someone who had seen me in ways Alex hadn't in years? You can't even look at me, can you? Alex continued, his voice shaking with anger. You've been out there with him all this time, and I've been here, trying to keep everything together. And this is what I get. I didn't know what to say. I couldn't defend myself. He was right. I had betrayed him. I'm sorry, Alex, I whispered. But the words felt hollow. They didn't mean anything anymore. How could they? How could I possibly make up for what I had done? Alex stood up abruptly, pushing his chair back. Sorry doesn't cut it, Tess. You don't get to apologize for this. You've already made your choice. My heart broke as I watched him walk away from me. He didn't look back, didn't say anything else. He just left the room, leaving me standing there, numb and lost. I wanted to go after him, to beg him to understand, to make him see that I hadn't meant for any of this to happen. But deep down, I knew it didn't matter anymore. The damage was done. The night stretched on in silence. Alex didn't come back. I sat at the table, my phone still lying there, the messages still visible. I couldn't bring myself to touch it, couldn't bring myself to face what I had done. It wasn't just about Garrett. It was about everything I had lost. It was about the years of emotional neglect, the growing distance between Alex and me, the loneliness that had driven me to this point. And now, I had destroyed everything. I couldn't undo it. I couldn't take back the kiss, the messages, the feelings. But I could feel the weight of the consequences settling in, and there was no escaping them now. As the night dragged on, I knew that this was the moment everything changed. The betrayal was no longer a secret, and neither Alex nor I would ever be the same again. Weeks had passed since Tess's betrayal, and the weight of it hung in the air between us, like a suffocating cloud we couldn't escape. Every room in the house felt empty, and every interaction with Tess felt like we were both just going through the motions. I tried to focus on my work, hoping it would provide me with some sort of distraction, but it only made everything worse. The longer I spent away from her, the more the truth settled in. I had been cheated on, yes, but more than that. I had been emotionally abandoned long before Tess physically stepped into Garrett's arms. She hadn't just betrayed me in the physical sense. She had stopped being my partner long before the affair even began. And that hurt more than anything. I couldn't escape the anger. The bitterness was eating at me from the inside out. The realization that I had allowed my work to consume me for so long, that I had neglected the very person who should have been my priority, gnawed at me every waking moment. Tess wasn't the only one to blame. I had been emotionally absent for years, buried in the demands of my career, and now it had all come crashing down. The marriage I had once taken for granted was gone. But there was one thing I knew. I wasn't going to let Tess's betrayal go unanswered. It wasn't just about revenge. It was about reclaiming control of my life, of feeling like I mattered again. It was about making sure that I wasn't the only one who had lost something in this mess. If Tess could have an affair with Garrett, then I could make my own choices, too. That's when I started noticing Mia more. She'd always been there, around the neighborhood or at events, always polite, always friendly. But now, as the tension between Tess and me grew, Mia's presence was like a breath of fresh air. She was attractive, intelligent, and most importantly, she was interested in me. For the first time in a long time, I didn't feel invisible. She listened to me, asked questions about my life and my thoughts, and actually seemed to care about what I had to say. It wasn't that I was looking for a replacement for Tess, but I couldn't help but feel drawn to the idea of someone showing me attention, someone who wasn't emotionally distant or distracted by their own needs. One evening, Tess was out with Garrett, and I found myself alone in the house, consumed by thoughts of everything that had happened. I invited Mia over under the pretense of discussing a potential business opportunity. The conversation started innocently enough, nothing that would raise any suspicions. But the more we talked, the more I realized how much I craved the connection that had been missing in my marriage. Mia noticed my sadness, the frustration and hurt that I had buried deep inside, and without thinking, she placed a hand on my shoulder. It was a small gesture, but it sent a shock through me, like a spark had been lit in my chest. I hadn't realized how much I had been starving for human connection until that moment. I wanted to feel something, anything other than the crushing weight of betrayal. Without a word, I leaned in. I kissed her. It wasn't planned. It wasn't logical. It was raw, driven by emotions I had been suppressing for far too long. But as soon as our lips met, it was like the floodgates had opened. All the anger, all the hurt, all the frustration I had been holding in came rushing to the surface. In that kiss, I found a sense of power that I hadn't felt in months. It wasn't about the physical act. It was about reclaiming some control over my life, over my emotions. I had been on the receiving end of betrayal for so long, and now, for the first time, I was the one making the choices. Mia didn't pull away. In fact, she leaned into it, her hands reaching up to touch my face as we kissed. When we broke apart, she looked at me with a mixture of understanding and desire. "Alex," she said softly, "I know you're going through a lot, but if you want more than just this, I'm here." Her words hung in the air like a challenge. And in that moment, I knew what I was doing. It wasn't just about revenge against Tess anymore. It was about taking control of my life, making my own choices, and finding a way to feel wanted again. I wasn't going to sit in the shadows anymore. I wasn't going to let Tess's betrayal define me. We continued seeing each other. What started as a kiss grew into something more. Mia became a constant presence in my life, and as our affair deepened, I felt a sense of power and satisfaction that I hadn't known in years. Every meeting, every stolen moment, felt like a victory, not just over Tess, but over everything that had kept me trapped for so long. I wasn't the one who had been wronged anymore. I was the one in control. Meanwhile, Tess was blissfully unaware. She continued to see Garrett, continuing her own affair while I did the same with Mia. But slowly, I could see the cracks forming in her facade. She began to notice the subtle changes in me, how I became more distant, how I no longer cared to engage with her the way I once had. I wasn't interested in her anymore, and I wasn't pretending to be. One evening, Tess confronted me. "I've noticed something, Alex," she said, her voice shaking with a mix of guilt and suspicion. "You've been different. You don't talk to me anymore. You're distant. What's going on?" I didn't answer her at first. Instead, I just looked at her, watching the cracks in her own armor deepen. I wasn't going to give her the satisfaction of an explanation. I wasn't going to let her twist the knife any further. "Nothing's going on," I replied curtly, my voice flat. "Just tired, Tess. Maybe you should take a closer look at your own life before accusing me of something." That was when it happened. One afternoon, Tess came across a receipt in the pocket of my jacket. It was a dinner receipt from a restaurant where Mia and I had shared a meal weeks earlier. I didn't think she would find it, but of course she did. I could see the shock in her eyes as she stared at the receipt, and I knew the truth had finally hit her. The betrayal she had inflicted upon me had come full circle. I was no longer the only one who had been deceived. Tess had crossed the line with Garrett, and now I had crossed my own line with Mia. Tess didn't say anything at first. She just stared at the receipt, her face pale. I could see the anger building behind her eyes, and for a brief moment, I felt a sense of satisfaction. She had been so caught up in her own affair that she hadn't noticed how far I had fallen. But now, the tables had turned. She was in the same position I had been in for so long. "I knew it," Tess whispered, her voice barely audible. I knew something was wrong. I didn't answer her. I didn't need to. The game we were both playing was no longer about love or marriage. It had become a cruel cycle of revenge, manipulation, and hurt, and neither of us knew how to stop it. The weeks that followed the discovery of our betrayals felt like an endless cycle of resentment and disillusionment. Tess and I, once so close, now lived in a state of cold indifference, each of us retreating further into our own worlds. The emotional chasm between us had become so wide that even if we tried, we couldn't reach each other. It was like standing on opposite shores of a vast, stormy ocean. Every attempt to communicate was swallowed by the waves of bitterness and hurt that had risen between us. There were no more attempts at small talk, no more trying to act like everything was fine. Every conversation felt like a battle, every look shared between us heavy with unspoken accusations. Our marriage had become a shell, a hollowed-out version of what it once was. There was nothing left but the ruins of a life we had once built together. And deep down, we both knew it was over. Tess, however, still had questions. She wanted the truth. She had been waiting for me to admit the affair with Mia, but by the time that moment came, I didn't have the energy to make excuses or try to explain myself. I was done with pretending. I wasn't angry. I wasn't regretful. I was just empty. One evening, as I sat at the kitchen table, Tess stood in front of me, her face pale, her eyes searching for something. Anything that might make sense of what had happened. She had already known the truth, but she needed to hear it from me, I suppose. "What's going on, Alex?" she demanded, her voice shaking with a mixture of anger and frustration. "You've been distant for so long. I know something's wrong. Just tell me." I looked at her calmly, as though I were speaking to a stranger. "I've been seeing Mia for weeks," I said flatly. "It's been going on for a while." Tess stood frozen, her breath catching in her throat. She had expected anger, regret, maybe even sorrow, but what she got instead was resignation. My resignation. There was nothing left for me to feel. No anger, no love, just a hollow understanding that our marriage was over. Tess, for all her fury, could see that in my eyes. She could see that I wasn't even willing to fight for us anymore. The silence between us felt suffocating. I could see the anger flash in her eyes, but there was something else there too, a deep, aching loss. She had always believed that our marriage could survive anything. I had once believed that too, but now it was clear. There was nothing left to fight for. And then, in that same detached tone, I spoke the words I knew would change everything. "I don't want to do this anymore, Tess. I can't keep pretending." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Tess couldn't speak. She couldn't even look at me. But she didn't need to. The truth had hit her, and she knew exactly what was happening. She didn't fight. She didn't beg for answers. She just nodded. And that was the last thing she did in our marriage. Nod, as if acknowledging that the end had come. That night, Tess left. I didn't try to stop her. I couldn't. My mind was numb, my heart a twisted mess of resentment and exhaustion. I knew I was the one who had pushed her away, but I couldn't bring myself to feel guilty anymore. Not after everything. Not after what she had done. She stayed with Garrett for a while, I suppose, but even in his arms, Tess was hollow. She had come to me in search of emotional connection, and that had failed her. She sought it in Garrett too, but the truth was, there was no one who could fill the emptiness she carried inside. She had betrayed me, but more than that, she had betrayed herself by believing that running to someone else would make her feel whole again. As for me, I threw myself into work. The house, once our home, now felt like a cage. It was empty, so empty. Every room reminded me of what I had lost, and the worst part was realizing that I had done it all to myself. My revenge had come at a great cost. I thought I'd regain control by turning the tables on Tess, but all I had done was tear apart the life we had built. There were no victories here, no redemption, just two people, broken and alone, each living with the consequences of their own choices. The days turned into weeks, and the house remained silent. I couldn't go back to the man I had been before. I had destroyed the very thing I was trying to protect. The affair with Mia had been a temporary fix, a way to feel like I still had power, but even that had burned me in the end. I couldn't change what I had done, and now I didn't know how to fix it. Tess had left, and I was left with nothing but the echoes of our marriage. I couldn't fix her, and I couldn't fix myself. In the end, Tess and I were both left alone, each of us carrying the weight of our mistakes. We were no longer the people we once were. What had begun as a marriage full of promise, love, and dreams had devolved into a bitter story of betrayal, revenge, and regret. Neither of us was the same person we had been when we met. We had become players in a cruel game, and now, all we had were the remnants of the life we had destroyed. We would pick up the pieces, but they would never fit back together. And in our hearts, we both knew that the damage was irreversible.